Winter 1943. A critical period in World War II. Two of history's greatest generals were facing each other across the Russian steppe. One was Erich von Manstein, Germany's most brilliant tactician.
Hitler had a profound respect for Manstein because, without doubt, he was one of the most competent field marshals he had, if not the most competent.
Von Manstein was recognized by all armies in the Second World War as probably the preeminent operational commander.
Against him was Georgy Zhukov, master of the Red Army and Stalin's enforcer.
He's very cold-blooded. He has very strong nerves, and he's prepared to be very ruthless.
That winter, Manstein would need all his skill. Zhukov's forces vastly outnumbered him. It looked as though his entire army could be driven into the sea. It's now that Manstein pioneered a new, highly mobile form of defensive warfare. It would temporarily alter the course of the war and become a classic military maneuver. It would also allow hundreds of thousands of German soldiers to have a very narrow escape. February 1943, the Eastern Front. Across southern Russia, the Red Army had the Germans on the run. There were some 300,000 German soldiers. But they were stretched across the Russian steppe in a front running hundreds of miles. Against them were over 500,000 Red Army troops. There was a real possibility the Germans would be routed and Hitler's entire Eastern Front would collapse. But it was not just a matter of numbers. The Germans were up against one of World War II's greatest generals. Georgy Zhukov was a man determined to restore respect to the Red Army. During much of 1941 and 42, it had been crushed by the German panzers. City after city had fallen to Hitler's forces. The Soviet army had been humiliated. But at Moscow, things had changed. Zhukov had made a stand. Here, in the autumn of 1941, he'd massed his troops and held off a determined German attempt to seize the capital. The German advance was checked. It had turned Zhukov into a national hero. Evan Maudsley has written extensively about the Red Army during World War II.
With that victory at Moscow, he suddenly becomes a kind of poster boy of the Red Army. He gets his picture on the front page of Pravda as a key military leader, and Moscow establishes him as a victorious general.
9 months later, Zhukov pulled off a second, even bigger victory. For months, the huge industrial city of Stalingrad, on the banks of the river Volga, had been besieged by German forces. Tens of thousands of Soviet civilians faced a brutal death. But then Zhukov was sent to take command. In November 1942, in total secrecy, he assembled a massive force. In a brilliant tactical maneuver, he launched a series of flanking movements that smashed through the German lines. Now, instead of the Russians, it was the Germans who were trapped. It would turn into Germany's biggest defeat of the war so far. Nearly 100,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner. Zhukov became Stalin's most trusted general.
Zhukov is the effective leader of the Red Army, certainly from the middle of 1942 onwards. He's someone who Stalin uses, who Stalin trusts. He is prepared to be very ruthless. He shoots division commanders if they've retreated without orders. And that does win Stalin's approval.
Zhukov's victory at Stalingrad halted the German advance through southern Russia. It was a turning point in the war on the Eastern Front. Now it was the Germans who were on the run. Major General Mungo Melvin is an expert in tactical and strategic warfare.
The map here shows the strategic situation on the Eastern Front. Soviet forces pushed the German forces back to this front line. The Germans have been suffering heavy casualties all the way back from Stalingrad.
Now, in February 1943, Zhukov went on the offensive.
Stalin orders offensives to be mounted in the general direction of Kharkov and Kiev and across the Don Basin to the lower Dnieper. Meanwhile, continuing the offensive from the Caucasus to effectively close the crossing at Rostov-on-Don. The German southern wing on the Eastern Front is in dire danger of collapsing.
Zhukov's plan was to drive the Germans out of the cities of Kharkov, Belgorod, and Rostov, trap them against the Black Sea, and then wipe them out. As the Red Army advanced, it didn't just have a great general with vastly superior forces. It was also better equipped.
The famous Russian tank is a T-34. It's heavily armed, it's heavily armored, it's fast, it's reliable, it works effectively in bad roads and in bad conditions.
The Russians also had the terrifying Katyusha multiple rocket launcher. The German forces in southern Russia were in deep trouble. But they had one hope. Zhukov was not the only great general on the battlefield. For over 2 years, Erich von Manstein had been behind some of Hitler's most successful operations. Richard Overy is a historian of World War II.
Manstein was in many ways the typical Prussian officer. Extremely thorough, efficient, very professional.
He had a military character and ethos deeply ingrained in his veins, with a great sense of German honor and tradition and discipline.
He took soldiering very seriously as part of his life.
In autumn 1940, Manstein had masterminded Hitler's invasion of Western Europe. The Allies had expected a direct attack through the flat, easy terrain of the Low Countries. But Manstein had wrong-footed them. He'd sent fast-moving panzer divisions through the heavily wooded Ardennes hills in a wide encircling movement that had cut off the Allied front lines. It was the last thing the Allies had expected.
The Manstein plan took the French and the British completely by surprise.
Discover the past with exclusive military history documentaries and ad-free podcasts presented by world-renowned historians, all on History Hit. Watch them on your smart TV or on the go with your mobile device. Download the app now to watch everything, from the gripping story of the Band of Brothers to Operation Barbarossa and D-Day. Immerse yourself in the dramatic stories of this remarkable era by signing up via the link in the description.
They looked to the Ardennes forest and they said, nobody's going to be able to get through that. We're going to be attacked through the Low Countries. And that's what they waited for. And of course, it's precisely what Manstein realized.
France had fallen to Manstein's plan in just 3 weeks. The success of the campaign saw him promoted to full general. Ten months later, he was a leading commander in the German blitzkrieg that stormed across Soviet Russia in the summer of 1941. Once again, the attack relied on fast-moving panzer divisions that simply overran the Russian defenses.
The armour moved forward very fast. So fast, of course, that it then created panic in the forces in front of them, because the forces didn't know where the Germans were. 1 minute they were in front of them, next minute they were behind them.
Within months, Manstein had pushed through to the Black Sea. Now, in February 1943, he was facing the Russian counterattack. The entire southern wing of the once mighty German army in the east was in danger of disintegrating. The stakes for the Germans could not have been higher. If Manstein lost, hundreds of thousands of German troops could be trapped and killed. It was now that he would pioneer an extraordinarily effective form of defensive warfare. It would not just change the course of the war, but shape defensive strategy for years to come. More immediately, it would turn what could have been a mass slaughter into a narrow escape. February the 6th, 1943. Von Manstein left for Germany for urgent talks with Hitler about what to do. A German account captures the drama of the meeting.
The waiting men fell silent, and Hitler gave them his angled salute without speaking. He then shook hands with Field Marshal von Manstein only. There was a paralyzed silence in the room.
Manstein reported that Germany had two options. The Supreme Command must either provide extra troops, or Hitler must allow his armies to retreat to more defensible positions. But to Hitler, retreat was unthinkable. First, he regarded the huge coal fields around Donetsk, known as the Donbass, as critical to the German war effort.
The Donbass is a major industrial region. It's important to the Germans, who want to hold it for their own purposes and to deny it to the Russians, and it's important to the Russians because they want to liberate it. So it is an area of considerable importance.
But Hitler was also vehemently opposed to the very idea of giving ground. It's not what a true German should do.
For him, this was always a psychological question. You know, if you retreated, you were a coward. If you moved forward, then you were, an effective German soldier. And simplistic though that was, he applied it as often as he could to his view of the battlefield. To Manstein, of course, this was complete nonsense. What determined the success on the battlefield was the position of your troops, the supply of weapons and new equipment. And, of course, above all, being willing to withdraw if it was necessary to withdraw, if only to prepare the ground better for an attack.
When the meeting broke up, Manstein returned to the Eastern Front with neither a promise of extra troops nor an agreement to withdraw. For Manstein, it was a dark moment. By 1943, Manstein was 56 years old. He'd been roughing it at the front for nearly 2 years. Three months earlier, his eldest son, Gero, had been killed near Leningrad.
This was a terrible blow to Manstein. This was probably the hardest thing that ever happened to him in his life. Visitors to his headquarters said that Manstein had become very quickly very old.
Lieutenant General Simon Mayle has served in Northern Ireland, the Balkans, and the Middle East. He knows what it's like at the front.
He will not have been sleeping well. He will not have been eating well. He will be tired. He will have enormous psychological burdens. A very, very lonely time. And conscious that if he fails, he could see the complete destruction of the German army in the south of Russia.
To make matters worse, Manstein had never joined the Nazi Party and had an uneasy relationship with Hitler.
Manstein, like I think quite a lot of the senior military, kept their distance from Hitler and from the Nazi Party. They were happy enough, of course, in the end to win victories for Germany, but they didn't see it as a victory for Hitler. And I think that always produced a certain tension. I think Hitler knew that Manstein was somebody who saw through him.
Manstein told friends he felt he was fighting a war on two fronts. Hitler behind him, Zhukov in front. It was an exhausting process.
When a senior commander, such as Manstein, begins to feel that he's no longer held in the confidence of the political leadership, then that becomes very eroding, and that undermines really the ability to get on with the job. And it wore him down.
Back in the field, Manstein told Hitler's chief of staff,
"Inform the Führer once more that I really must have freedom of maneuver in order to command. He always thinks that I demanded only to be able to retreat more quickly. The opposite is the case."
He signed off,
"If the Führer doesn't trust me, then he must seek another."
but his appeal for greater freedom of action fell on deaf ears. February the 9th, 1943. Zhukov's offensive was in full swing. Russian forces recaptured the city of Belgorod. Soon they were closing in on the city of Kharkov from three sides. It was an important prize. the second biggest city in Ukraine and the fourth largest in Russia. On February the 13th, Hitler issued orders to hold it at all costs. Thousands of German troops attempted to defend it. But Zhukov's Russian forces poured in men and firepower. The weather turned bitterly cold. The Germans were outgunned. There was a risk they'd be wiped out in a hopeless defense of the city. Manstein took a desperate decision. He deliberately disregarded Hitler and ordered a withdrawal. He commented acidly,
"The army group had no intention of sacrificing an army for Kharkov."
By February the 16th, the withdrawal was complete, and the Red Army was in charge of the city.
Kharkov is a really important symbol of the industrial Ukraine. So when it's recaptured by the Red Army, it is a major success and a major setback for the Germans.
Zhukov's soldiers now scented victory. One wrote in his diary,
"We are crossing liberated territory, land that has been occupied by the Germans for more than 2 years. The population is coming out to greet us with joy, bringing us apples, pears, tomatoes, cucumbers, and so on."
By mid-February, the Russian spearheads had pushed over 200 miles into German-held territory. As the Germans retreated, they did everything they could to hold back the Russian advance. They blew up bridges, buildings, and airfields. Roads and railway lines were destroyed. It was a brutal policy of scorched earth. Yet, ironically, it prodded the Russians into even greater efforts.
When Soviet soldiers came across ruined villages, there's no doubt that this fired them up to do what the Soviet propaganda was telling them to do, which is to kill as many Germans as you could.
The Germans were playing into Zhukov's hands. All he needed to do was keep going. And his plan to push the Germans into the Black Sea would be complete. Von Manstein would need all his brilliance to save the situation. February the 17th. Hitler flew to von Manstein's headquarters on the Dnieper for another emergency meeting. An eyewitness account of Hitler's arrival with his dog Blondie recorded,
"I discovered with a shudder that Hitler had very bad breath. As I took his coat, there was a savage outburst from the Alsatian bitch. I hung the coat on the clothes stand, and I could have sworn that in the pockets there were 2 pistols."
For 3 days, Hitler and Manstein argued. Hitler demanded an instant end to the retreat and that Kharkov be retaken. But Manstein, convinced the Germans had neither the troops nor weapons, suggested an alternative. The only problem, it ran directly counter to Hitler's wishes. Manstein's plan was a sudden and powerful transition from retreat to attack. It's known as elastic or mobile defense.
If you withdraw strategically and concentrate your forces, make sure they're being effectively supplied, don't overcommit yourself, then you are the one able to choose the moment where you re-engage again. And you turn your defense into attack.
It's rather like chess. You are not looking just at the first 2 or 3 moves. You are looking to your opponent's game plan and developing a set of moves against him. So in some ways, you might appear to be losing. You might be withdrawing. And just at the moment when he believes he is winning, you then unleash a vicious counterattack that knocks him completely off balance.
Manstein explained the idea to Hitler in some detail.
What he wants to do, and this is the plan he gives to Hitler, is to pull the German line back onto the river Dnieper and give ground to lure the Soviet forces into a killing zone of his own choice, making them overextend, and be prepared to lose the Donetsk basin. This would set the conditions for a counterattack in 2 stages. One, to recover Kharkov, and secondly, to crush the Russian forces against the Sea of Azov. With this type of powerful counteroffensive, Manstein believes he can defeat the Soviet spring offensive and start to set the conditions for a stalemate, if not a draw, on the Eastern Front.
But Hitler hated the whole idea. He still hadn't grasped the concept of a strategic retreat.
Hitler had no understanding of how to operate a battlefield, he had no understanding really about what made a battlefield work. You see photographs of them standing side by side looking over maps, and it's clear from their body language that Hitler doesn't like having to be told what to do by Manstein.
Three days later, Hitler would return to Germany without making it clear whether he had accepted Manstein's tactics or not. Manstein recorded that he and Hitler were living in 2 different worlds.
Hitler's talking about holding on to the Don Basin because of the economic requirement. And Manstein is saying, I don't think you understand. I don't have the forces to hold on to this.
But with Hitler gone, Manstein was free to make his own decisions. It was a critical moment for the Germans. But the Russians were also facing big decisions. As the Red Army pressed forward towards the river Dnieper, it was beginning to outrun its supply lines. Allied aid, in the form of tents, blankets, food, and radios, was pouring in. But the Russian commander, Georgy Zhukov, faced a dilemma. How far and fast should he advance before his forces became overextended and vulnerable to a counterattack? Supply depots were now hundreds of miles in the rear.
I think the problem which the Russians have is that it's really a very long way. They haven't got the kind of motor transport required to maintain the momentum. The more the Germans pull back, the less acute their supply problems become. The more the Russians advance, the worse theirs become. So logistics, supply problems are a key feature of these battles.
'These feature of these battles. 'These feature of these battles. 'These feature of these battles. 'These feature of these battles. 'These feature of these battles. 'These feature of these battles. 'These feature of these battles. 'These feature of these battles. 'These feature of these battles. 'These feature of these battles. 'These feature of these battles. 'These feature of these battles. 'These feature of these battles. 'These feature of these battles. 'These feature of these battles. 'These feature of these battles. 'These feature of these battles. 'These feature of these battles. 'These feature of these battles. 'These feature of these battles. 'These feature of these battles. 'These feature of these battles. 'These feature of these battles. 'These feature of these battles. 'These fe For Zhukov, it was a difficult balancing act. Stalin wanted him to push forward and crush the Germans. But Zhukov knew his supply lines were at breaking point. Finally, he decided to press home the attack. As he did so, he drew comfort from the thought that he was chasing a retreating and defeated army.
The Russian advance is a gamble to the extent that they stretch their supply lines. The further forward they race in an attempt to win this gamble, the more they weaken their own forces.
As Zhukov surveyed the situation, one question dominated his thoughts. Was he in danger of overplaying his hand? On February the 19th, Manstein laid his trap. It started with a series of tactical retreats.
The main Russian attack, Operation Gallop, continues to push in a southwesterly direction, threatening the key crossings of the river Dnepr, including the one at Manstein's own headquarters at Zaporizhzhia. A thin line of German forces is insufficient to hold that offensive. Manstein, just in time, manages to get the SS Panzer Corps out of Kharkov, ready to form a hard shoulder here around Krasnograd.
It was phase one of Manstein's trap. He'd concentrated some of his forces on Zhukov's northern flank. Their job would be to slow the Russian advance.
Meanwhile, the last German forces are coming from the Caucasus, and he's able to assemble the main attacking force here to the south of the main Russian offensive.
Their task would be to punch through and destroy Zhukov's main attack. The maneuver was an extraordinary feat of logistics.
Moving an army, which is in the region of nearly 100,000 people, with X thousand tanks, X thousand soft-skin vehicles, vast amounts of supplies, in the middle of an absolutely ferocious Russian winter, is a feat of logistic genius. In the depths of the darkest, coldest night, Manstein must have been almost overwhelmed, along with his staff, by the sheer complexity, the scale of the potential disaster facing him.
By the evening of February the 19th, the trap was set. The Germans were now concentrated on both flanks of the Russian spearhead. Both Zhukov and Manstein were embarking on one of the biggest gambles of their lives. Whoever won would shape the war on the Eastern Front for the foreseeable future. On February the 20th, 1943, Manstein sprung his trap. He moved from defense to offense. After weeks of defending, it was a welcome change. The first force moved down from Krasnograd to attack the Russians' northern flank.
That involves a minor attack in this direction here to slow down the main Soviet offensive, whilst the mass of his army group attacks in a northerly direction to defeat these Soviet forces.
Manstein's aim was to make up for his lack of numbers by concentrating all his forces on Zhukov's weakest points. He knew the Red Army's crack divisions would be at the front of the spearhead. Further back, the men would be less experienced. The fighting was fast and furious. Zhukov had a reputation as a man who had never lost a battle.
It was a tough battle, because by this stage, of course, the Red Army had its tail up.
But the Russians were caught by surprise. With their most experienced forces up at the front, they had nothing to respond with.
It's difficult for the Russians. They have to change their assumptions about whether the German army is broken or not, and the answer seems to be no, it's not. The Germans are more resilient than we had originally hoped.
The Germans also had the new Tiger tank. It was more than a match for the Russian T-34. German bombers caused terrible destruction to the Russian lines. The Russians started to run short of fuel and ammunition. Their tanks, in particular, urgently needed repairing. But the repair units were miles from the front lines, too far to be helpful. In desperation, Zhukov's forces hurled themselves forward, though they were fast running out of everything.
I think that one of the Russian shortcomings is they don't expect the Germans to be able to regroup as effectively as they do. What the Germans show is remarkable resilience. They show an ability to improvise even in the face of disaster.
By the evening of March the 4th, the exhausted Russian armies disintegrated. Whole units were rounded up and taken prisoner. Zhukov had been beaten.
Soviet losses on the southern front were substantial in the Manstein counteroffensive. It was a real blow to the Red Army.
The Germans would later claim to have counted 23,000 Russian dead on the battlefield, and to have captured tens of thousands of Russian prisoners. It had been a stunning reversal of fortunes. But Manstein was not finished. With Zhukov's troops shattered and in retreat, Manstein pressed home his advantage. His forces now returned to Kharkov. By March the 10th, the Germans were in the northern suburbs of the city. For 3 days, there was vicious house-to-house fighting.
German aircraft and tanks pushed forward, trying to reignite the traditions of the initial blitzkrieg attack. German aircraft pounded Soviet positions in Kharkov, destroyed what was left of an already crumbling city.
3 days later, the Russians pulled out.
Kharkov was captured. Very large numbers of Soviet soldiers once again fell into German hands. The Germans pushed forward themselves now very rapidly. And the Soviet offensive fell apart.
Three days after that, Manstein's forces retook Belgorod.
But by the time they reach Belgorod, the German army has run out of puff. The rains have come, and all armoured and wheeled movement grinds to a halt.
As the spring thaw set in, military movements became impossible. The two sides were deadlocked. But it had been a stunning victory for Manstein. A man known for his mastery of blitzkrieg had pioneered a new, highly mobile kind of defense. For hundreds of thousands of German soldiers in danger of being trapped at the Black Sea, it had been an extraordinarily narrow escape. During the summer of 1943, as the Red Army grew stronger and better organized, Hitler's forces would once again face overwhelming odds on many occasions. But Manstein's mobile defense enabled them to turn a potential rout into a controlled retreat, time and time again. Each time he made up for his lack of numbers with speed and agility.
Manstein's defense in southern Russia in 1943 has come to be regarded by battlefield strategists as a classic example of elastic defense.
6 months later, Manstein's defensive strategy would allow over 500,000 German soldiers to safely retreat across the Dnieper River. Some historians have estimated von Manstein's elastic defense may have significantly prolonged the war.
Manstein's ability to conduct a huge battle of maneuver and counter-maneuver, in my estimation, delayed the end of the war an absolute minimum of 3 or 6 months, perhaps a year.
But in Germany, von Manstein's constant rows with Hitler had taken their toll. His willingness to give up territory had run counter to all Hitler's instincts.
There was still an uneasy relationship between him and Hitler. I think that Hitler always realized that Manstein understood the battlefield, could manage the battlefield much more effectively than he could.
In March 1944, Hitler relieved von Manstein of his command.
Hitler's tactic when he wanted to get rid of a general, of course, was suggest that the general was sick or, might have a rescuer of some kind or other. And it was the same really with Manstein. So in the end, in the early summer of 1944, they parted company. And Manstein ended the war inactive.
One of Germany's most talented generals would sit out the closing months of the war from his home. May the 7th, 1945. The Nazis surrendered.
Nuremberg, Germany, once the holy city of Nazism, becomes the setting of an epic event. Here, under the vigilant eyes of Allied military police, the 20 most important surviving members of the Hitler gang go on trial.
One of the men who would face trial was Erich von Manstein. But unexpectedly, he'd got fans on the Allied side, where he was seen as a professional soldier, but not a Nazi.
Extraordinarily, he is defended by a Labour Member of Parliament, George Paget, who speaks up very firmly on his behalf. Many of Manstein's subordinates come forward in his defence. Winston Churchill pays into a fighting fund for Manstein's defence. Manstein is tried on 17 counts. He is cleared on 8 and convicted on 9 of them.
He was sentenced to 18 years prison, later reduced to 12. Meanwhile, the world moved on. The Second World War was replaced by the Cold War. Soviet and Western forces faced each other across an Iron Curtain. On the eastern side, Manstein's old enemy, Marshal Zhukov, now Stalin's Minister of Defense, amassed a huge Red Army. It vastly outnumbered NATO's forces in the West.
There was a very interesting parallel between the situation facing NATO in Germany in the Cold War and that which had faced German forces on the Eastern Front. There was a massive Soviet force stood by to launch an attack on NATO. The best way to deal with that attack would be to develop some form of mobile defense.
It was now Western leaders' turn to the one obvious expert, Erich von Manstein. After serving only 4 years of a 12-year jail sentence, he was released. Manstein, the genius behind the invasion of Western Europe in the name of fascism, became the defender of Western democracy.
Because he'd been able to distance himself, in a sense, from the nastier aspects of the Third Reich, and because it was clear that he'd played a very important part in the operational successes of the German armed forces, the West was very interested in what he had to offer.
Over the following years, Manstein would become an advisor on NATO's defense against the Red Army.
I've unearthed quite a lot of evidence of war games and other material that showed that NATO had looked very carefully at what Manstein had done, particularly in his counterattack at Kharkov in 1943, as a model for the type of counterattacks that might be mounted.
Zhukov would later call von Manstein a worthy opponent.
When the war was over, Zhukov said, the one person I really regard as a capable opponent was Field Marshal Manstein.
Today, the tactics Manstein hammered out over half a century ago are still studied in military colleges, where they're regarded as not just a preeminent example of defensive strategy, but also the reason for one of the great narrow escapes of World War II. It was one of the greatest last-ditch stands of the Second World War. Outnumbered by 10 to 1, a tiny garrison of British and Indian troops stood firm against the might of the Imperial Japanese Army.
These men were on the verge of being overrun. But they were going to fight to the death.
The stakes could not have been higher. If the British lost, India and its wealth of resources would have been at the mercy of the Japanese.
As far as the Japs were concerned, they really needed shooting before they shot me. Simple as that.
This is the story of how the Japanese laid siege to the small Indian village of Kohima. It came down to a matter of yards between the Japanese and British trenches.
There was no escape. No. You either had to win or die.
The heroism of a handful of British and Indian soldiers became a defining moment in the war in the Far East. March 1944. The Americans were forcing the Japanese to retreat in the Pacific. The Imperial Army was staring at defeat in World War II. They had never been beaten before. In a desperate bid for victory, they turned their attention to the British and India. The Japanese commander in the region, General Mutaguchi, hoped to cause an uprising against the British in the eastern provinces of the country.
Bengal had suffered a serious famine the previous year, and the British were very unpopular at the way they'd handled this. Mutaguchi had with him Subhas Chandra Bose, the leader of the Indian National Army. They expected the whole of Bengal to rise up and welcome them and help to get rid of the British.
Mutaguchi had this very, very strong view that this could be the first of a series of stepping stones into India itself, not just to prevent the British from invading Burma, but to cause the complete collapse of the Raj.
The Japanese began amassing their troops just 120 miles from India, by the river Chinwin in Burma. To reach Bengal, their advance would have to go through Kohima, a sleepy colonial outpost of the British Raj. Set in the foothills of the Himalayas, Kohima was inhabited by the local Naga people. It was governed for the British by Deputy Commissioner Charles Pawsey.
Charles Pawsey was the quintessential English civil servant, transplanted to the Naga Hills, a place, impossibly remote and wild. And he was a man very beloved by the local Naga people. He was somebody whom they could depend on for justice.
Pawsey lived an idyllic life in a bungalow with a large garden and a tennis court. Kohima was regarded by the British as a charming retreat from the heat of the plains, and not in any imminent danger. Little did they know, the village sat squarely in the crosshairs of a planned invasion. The Japanese did not expect any resistance in Kohima, and to then take the British base in Dimapur, 50 miles beyond.
The plan of Mutaguchi was that they would make a rapid advance to Kohima, to Dimapur, and then on into India. Now, they were not prepared at all for a long campaign, assuming that they would take Dimapur and have all the supplies from there.
On the 16th of March, 1944, the Japanese commander, General Mutaguchi, ordered the invasion to commence. 65,000 fighting men in a three-pronged advance would move through the mountains and rout the British from India.
The Japanese attack was meticulously planned. They'd had a young officer go and recce the area, and when they set out, they had prefabricated bridges over every river that they had to cross. So that shows the detail with which this advance was planned.
The Japanese made rapid progress through the matted jungle of the Naga Hills. Just 2 days' march from Kohima, an ambitious general, Miyazaki, took his leading troops on a diversion to impress his commanders. He attacked the small village of Sangshak, where the 50th Parachute Brigade was stationed.
Miyazaki took a decision. I think it's the most important decision in the Far East campaign. He thought, if I capture Sangshak, that will add to my glory. I'll do that in no time and keep going to Kohima.
It was a fatal mistake. The 50th Parachute Regiment fought heroically in Sangshak, holding their ground for 8 days, delaying the Japanese advance. For the Imperial Army, it was a shock to find the enemy fighting back with such ferocity.
山岳で陣地に行った時には途中でね、やはり倒れている日本兵がかなりいましたからね、折り重なって英軍とね、英軍の人たちと折り重なって日本軍の死体もありましたからね。日本のやはりあれも500人近い戦死傷者が出てましたからね。
It was an entirely unnecessary battle for the Japanese. They could very, very easily have bypassed Sangshak, and it would have meant that they arrived at Kohima on time and with all their forces intact.
Not only were the Japanese delayed, but plans were found on the body of a Japanese officer that revealed a massive invasion of northern India was on its way. The sheer scale of the advance sent shivers down the spine of British command. In charge of the Eastern Division of the British Army in India was General Bill Slim.
We used to call him Uncle Bill. And he used to love being called Uncle Bill. And he said, "You can win. The Japanese can be beaten." And he said, "You are the men that are going to do it," you know. And that was it.
There was an aura of efficiency and determination about him, which I think was recognized by the lowest, humblest soldier, really. He never promised anything that he couldn't achieve.
Slim realized the Japanese had one fundamental weakness: resources. Fighting the Americans and the Chinese on several fronts, the Imperial Army and the supplies that went with them were spread desperately thin.
Slim said the way in which you defeat the Japanese is to fight them where we're strongest and they're weakest. Slim's plan was to degrade the Japanese forces to the extent that they would run out of steam. His whole plan was about rolling with the Japanese punches.
Slim would let the Japanese advance, and in time, they would run out of both food and ammunition. It was therefore crucial that British supplies in Dimapur were protected from falling into Japanese hands.
Slim realised that there were no adequate defences in Kohima, and above all that Dimapur was at risk. So he had to rush units. This is the 5th Indian Division, of which the Royal West Kents were a part. So they were bundled into planes and flown towards Kohima.
The Royal West Kents were a prestigious British regiment, known in the army as the Dirty Half-Hundred. They had inherited the name from their predecessors, the Queen's 50th Foot Regiment from the Napoleonic Wars, who wore black cuffs and collars, which would dirty their faces when they went into battle. Private Les Crouch was 20 when he joined the West Kents.
We were the Dirty Half-Hundred. Where there was trouble, the West Kents were there. Dunkirk, North Africa, we even had 6 months in Iraq.
Infantry Platoon Commander Peter de Risa was a second lieutenant in the regiment.
I was privileged and very proud to have joined a cracking battalion. And there was a great spirit.
Jack Locke joined the West Kents at 19 and served as a quartermaster's sergeant.
I don't think there could have been a better unit than the West Kents. All for one and one for all.
The West Kents were rushed to Kohima and started digging defences around a village, hopelessly unprepared for war.
We just got out of the trucks very quickly and up the hill, and were trenches partly dug and some finished, some with head covers, some not. The immediate task was to improve them.
The Japanese were now just a few miles from Kohima. But before the West Kents had finished digging in, British command made an extraordinary decision. They pulled the West Kents out of Kohima and back to Dimapur, 50 miles away. There was disagreement as to which was the more important to protect.
And we were driven back to Dimapur. It was confusion, yes. No one knew what they were doing. No one knew anything. No one realised the Japanese were so close.
Organising the withdrawal for D Company in the West Kents was Major Donald Easton.
I wasn't privy to the minds of the generals, but we guessed that there was a cock-up somewhere, and there was probably a row going on between two generals, and we were the pawns.
The Deputy Commissioner, Charles Pawsey, was furious. Kohima and the Naga people he cared so much about would be left to the mercy of the Japanese. Whilst all other civilians fled the town, Pawsey defiantly remained.
He refused to go. He said, no, they're my people and I'm staying with them. And did. And he was guarded by two Naga spearmen.
On April 4th, 1944, the Japanese army opened fire on the perimeter trenches around the Kohima Ridge. The West Kents were immediately driven back from Dimapur at high speed and told to man the minimal defences that had been dug.
As we got out of our trucks, we were fired on. In fact, I had two men wounded on the road. So we were right into the thick of the battle, right from the start, virtually.
I gave orders to my men, if none of you have written your wills, I suggest you write them tonight. A little voice beside me said, I don't think I'd say that sort of thing again, sir. I don't think it went down too well.
Indian Rajputs, Gurkhas and Assam Rifles were also stationed in Kohima to bolster the West Kent's defence. But half the tiny garrison were non-combatants, and 15,000 Japanese soldiers were bearing down on them.
That 1,500 men included lots of individuals who didn't even have weapons. They were cooks, bottle washers, administrators of various kinds, who were stuck within the perimeter and who were unable to get out.
I had one chap who was obviously terrified. Sort of chap who would never, ever have thought of his life of being a soldier. So I just told him to follow me around the place. And I suppose in the First World War I'd have had him shot. In this one I thought, well, you know, you might be useful sometime.
After just 2 days, the Japanese encircled Kohima.
After the battalion had got into the position at Kohima, the Japanese then cut the road, and that was it. We were surrounded. We were under siege from the Japanese.
The British and Indian garrison would have to face an entire division of the Japanese army on their own.
They attacked heavily. All day long, we were shelled. No break. Well, that was pretty rough.
Getting 75mm artillery firing at you over open sights at 800 yards is both lethal and scary, really.
After a night of Japanese pounding the Kohima perimeter, the British were forced to withdraw.
壕が退却して一部退却して壕が残っていたわけね。そこへ僕らの第一大隊がそこへ入ったんです。出たら撃たれちゃうから。
However, the risk of being killed was no deterrent to most Japanese soldiers.
We saw the Japanese in the first attack. They'd infiltrated into a sort of workshop area. And that was the time that Peter de Riza won his military cross.
My sergeant and I shot up this warehouse. We really shot it up. We overheated one barrel, and then I led an attack in and we threw grenades. And the Japs ran out. The rest of the company and I had a turkey shoot. And if I recall rightly, there were 44 dead Japs lying around.
The eyes of the world were now on India and the attempted Japanese invasion. Slim knew the tiny garrison in Kohima would be insufficient to hold up the huge number of Japanese infantry who were attacking the town.
It didn't take long for Slim to recognize that this was going to be a significant problem. And it was at this stage, within days of the Japanese arriving, that orders were given to the 2nd British Division, who were way over on the western side of India, to start moving by train across to Kohima.
Most of the 2nd Division were more than 2,000 miles away. It would take them a week to get to the region by rail. After 5 days of vicious fighting, Kohima had been transformed from a beautiful hill village into a ravaged battlefield. Anyone outside of a trench or bunker was liable to be shot within seconds.
The rule at night is that if you're out of your trench, you were treated as enemies. Anyone running through the position could be shot. Troops weren't able to leave their trenches during the day because of the fear and the threat of sniping. Japanese snipers were ubiquitous. They wouldn't just snipe with rifles, but with cannons and large caliber weaponry. And they were very, very accurate.
In front of my bunker, there was a tree. And I leant back against the tree, and evidently this sniper saw me. Must have been instinct or something, but I must have just leant forward a bit, you know. And of course there was this. And the lad said, "You all right, Annie?" I said, "Yeah, I am." He missed me. And I took my shirt off, and my shirt was all scorched all the way down the back. Oh, I said, I thought it was a bit burny.
On April the 13th, 1944, 56 British and Indian soldiers were killed in a single day from shelling and gunfire. But the garrison in Kohima kept fighting. The Japanese had hoped to overwhelm them by sheer weight of numbers. They hadn't expected the resistance and bravery they found there.
野手ではね、やはりね、少しずつ一つ一つ取っていくわけですからね。もう向こうの砲撃だと逆襲っていうのはね、かなりだからあれだけ逆襲する英軍の戦力もね、バカにできないっていうことですよ。
One British soldier was awarded a Victoria Cross during the siege for single-handedly taking on the Japanese.
A Lance Corporal Harmon attacked the Japanese and overcame a machine gun post and killed all of the people in it. And then the next day he went forward again.
He told his section to give him covering fire. And he charged down the hill, fixed bayonet, and shot 2 or 3 Japanese and bayoneted another, and another one ran away.
He started walking back saying, I got the lot of them. And they said, run, run.
Come on, run! No!
Unfortunately shot in the back by the Japanese. He came up the hill, he died in my arms.
Run!
Very brave man.
"10 days into the siege, and Slim's plan began to work. The Japanese were unable to get supplies up to the front line.
龍馬は来ないですよね。ありましたね。とにかく草ばっかし食べとったような感じですね。
The West Kents were also running low on supplies and ammunition. But Slim had foreseen this problem. With American support, the Allies dominated the skies.
Slim's great tactical innovation is to use air power in a way that nowadays we take for granted. The idea that if you get troops who are isolated, you fly in supplies and you drop the supplies to them. Food, ammunition, medical stores. Slim starts to use this in fighting the Japanese, and they don't know how to respond. Because for the first time, they're facing British and Indian troops who don't run away, who dig in, who fight, and are supplied from the air.
Water was the principal concern for both the British and Japanese, as there was no natural supply in Kohima.
Every drop of water we got went to the cookhouse. And we had about half a cup of tea a day. We couldn't shave, we couldn't wash, we couldn't do anything. We didn't take our clothes off the whole time we were there. And we absolutely stunk.
The hills of Kohima became littered with the remains of the airdrops. However, it wasn't only the British who became reliant on them.
で時々ね落下傘がねこの敵の陣地と日本の陣地の間が落ちるわけでそれを奪い合うのね。チーズとかガムとかねタバコとかそういうのが入ってるんだな。ああ敵はいいなあんなものを食べてるんだなと思ってね羨ましがってたねみんなが。
Losing food and water to the Japanese was difficult for the men to cope with, but the airdrops also contained other vital supplies.
We were told that our 3-inch mortar ammunition would be in red parachutes. Oh dear, we watched the red parachutes land in the Japanese lines. And I can remember saying to somebody, or they saying to me, we're going to get that lot back in a short while. And we did.
The suffering on both sides was beginning to take its toll.
The worst thing, really, were the wounded, the badly wounded, because he couldn't be got out, you see. They just had to lie there in trenches. And some more, an enormous number were wounded a second time.
There was one terrible moment when they had a large trench where the medics were doing operations on badly wounded men, and a mortar bomb fell in the trench and just destroyed all of them. It's hard to understand the real suffering at that time in that siege.
You had in that place a cloud of bluebottles, of flies, settling on the bodies of the dead. You had the sweat, the filth of hundreds of frightened men crammed together. There was nowhere to bury human waste. Occasionally, the British would see the Japanese coming out and trying to burn the bodies of their own dead. And this added to the general sense of apocalyptic horror which covered that battlefield.
The Kohima perimeter began to collapse. The West Kents and Indian soldiers were pushed back towards their divisional headquarters in Charles Pawsey's bungalow. News reached the few remaining soldiers that reinforcements, in the form of the 2nd Division, were in the region, trying to break the Japanese stranglehold on Kohima. The West Kents were now desperate to be relieved.
You had this sort of feeling as, well, surely tomorrow they'll get through to us. And then tomorrow comes and you think, well, it must be tomorrow. And then tomorrow comes again, and so it goes on. I think a lot of people were thinking like that. I know I was.
By now, the opposing trenches were now just 100 yards apart, across Pawsey's tennis court. It seemed only a matter of time before the British were completely overrun.
Every night, the Japanese would attack. In the morning, we'd find there were little pockets of Japanese had lodged themselves almost in amongst us. They were incredibly brave, the Japanese. And one could say foolhardy.
あれですよ、最後には最後の一角まで英軍の陣地を攻略していったわけだからね。ではまあ英軍に聞いたら一番わかるんじゃないですか。英軍はどういう具合にね、自分たちの力の戦闘の効果があったのかっていうのは我々にはちょっとわかりませんけれどもね。
The front line between the British and Japanese became so close. The two sides were now fighting cheek by jowl.
A man was in a trench on the tennis court, and the Japanese overran the trench. He was marooned at the bottom, but he was still alive. The Japanese spent the rest of the day standing on him and so on. And then when it got to the dark, he jumped up and ran back to the British side. So it was as close as that.
The Japanese led wave after wave of kamikaze charges at the last line of British defense.
When you looked out across that tennis court, what was coming was this horde of screaming men. Who you knew, the moment they reached you, would attack you with incredible ferocity.
They got to the entrances of our bunkers and poured the petrol in and ignited it. It was terrible because I could hear the men screaming out. My platoon had been killed, all of them.
On the 16th of April, 1944, after 12 days of brutal fighting, the siege of Kohima entered its endgame.
You fired and you fired and you fired. And when your ammunition ran out or your gun jammed, you killed, as some men did, with axes, with entrenching tools, with bayonets, with the butts of rifle. This kind of hand-to-hand ferocity was typical of Kohima, particularly down at the tennis court.
Knowing the barbarity of Japanese soldiers to prisoners, surrender didn't even enter the minds of the shrinking battalion of West Kents.
Not once did any of my men ever say to me, "Look, sir, this is stupid. Let's jack it in." It just was not an option. The Japanese soldier, we all knew them to be dangerous things that had to be shot on sight.
But if their spirits remained unbowed, the West Kents knew, unless reinforcements arrived, their bodies could not fight on.
What really worried us, I think, was how long we could keep going. I mean, obviously you didn't voice your feelings. That's not an officer's job. The officer's job was to keep everybody going.
These men were on the verge of being overrun. That's certainly what they felt. I think it was a matter of hours.
Then, on April the 18th, 1944, the lead unit of the long-awaited 2nd Division was heard across the valley.
All of a sudden there was sort of lovely distant booming, and then and it was 2 divisional artillery in range and plastering the Jap positions. It was music to one's ears. That was terrific. In fact, I even feel emotional now thinking of it.
The wounded and exhausted West Kents and Indian soldiers were finally evacuated from Kohima. For those that survived, it was a narrow escape against impossible odds. But many were not so fortunate.
Came out of the trench, ready to come away, and the chap standing next to me was killed outright. That was right at the end. Could quite easily have been me. I was one of the lucky ones.
The regiments of the 2nd Division, including the Punjabs, the Dorsets and the Royal Berkshires, had broken the siege of Kohima.
Colonel of the Berkshire Regiment said, I saw the West Kent garrison marching down the hill, unshaven, bearded, gaunt, filthy uniforms, but carrying their weapons. Soldiers I would have been proud to command, and I thought, that's lovely.
The siege may have ended, but the battle was far from over. The Japanese dug their defences deeper into the ground, determined not to give an inch back to the 2nd Division.
The Japanese in defence were immovable. Muslim himself describes the Japanese as warrior ants. Every single trench had to be taken. Every Japanese body had to be checked to make sure that it was dead.
The tennis court remained the front line until the British Royal Engineers managed to cut a road to get a tank up the hill.
戦意っていうのはだんだんやっぱりなくなるんじゃないですかね。ただ最後には戦車が出てきましたからね。で戦車だと割合と近くまで接近してきて、でこちらの重火器陣地を狙い撃ちするからね、かなり英軍にとっては戦車のああいう山岳地帯だけども戦車の使用が効果的であったんじゃないですかね。
With thousands dead, and the surviving soldiers unable to fight on due to starvation and a lack of ammunition. On June the 3rd, 1944, the Japanese finally withdrew.
餓死状態だからね、みんな。もう本当にフラフラして餓死で亡くなった兵隊もおるんです。とにかく川べりの近く行ったら誰かもう餓死してもう餓死ですわ、主に死んだのは。
The path back to Burma became known as the Road of Bones. 30,000 of Mutaguchi's original 65,000 fighting men died during the campaign.
The scale of the defeat at Kohima is the thing that matters. For the Japanese psyche, this was a shattering blow. Nothing like this had ever happened to the Japanese Imperial Army. Psychologically, the impact on the Japanese was devastating.
It was there the Japanese were stopped. All their advances, which had gone on throughout Singapore, Malaya, Burma, they were stopped there by a single battalion of the British Army.
They just thought they could overwhelm us by sheer numbers. They hadn't reckoned on the courage of the ordinary British soldier who said, "To hell with you, you're not going to chuck me out of here."
Every year, the few remaining veterans from Kohima meet to remember the fallen at York Minster.
We did a job, and that's what all my lads, because there's not many of us left now, but we did a job, and we did it well.
Thanks to the bravery and determination of a few hundred soldiers, the Japanese were defeated by the British and Indians for the first time. For the West Kents and the soldiers of the 2nd Division, Kohima remains the defining moment of their lives.
When I think of it now, almost, it makes me cry.
General Slim's men call themselves the Forgotten Army, but their story has never been forgotten. The monument to the men who died in Kohima reads, "When you go home, tell them of us and say, for their tomorrow, we gave our today." April 1941. On the North African coast, the town of Tobruk was under siege. Leading the attack, General Erwin Rommel, the German master of shock and awe.
The crux of Rommel's tactical approach was pace. He wanted to be able to surprise and dislocate and disorientate his enemies. He was a very, very fine practitioner of war.
Only Tobruk stood between Rommel and the capture of Egypt's Suez Canal, Britain's vital link to its empire in the east. Facing Rommel were inexperienced troops from Britain and the Commonwealth. Led by a former schoolmaster, the Australian General Leslie Morshead.
Morshead was a very far-thinking, intelligent commander. He achieved something that is completely forgotten. I mean, he's an understated hero.
His orders were to hold on for 8 weeks. Bombarded by land and air, the brave rats of Tobruk dug in.
We were in action 24 hours a day and never a break.
The question was, could Morshead's men resist the onslaught of Rommel and his Italian allies? Or would Tobruk fall, and with it, the Suez Canal?
We knew if he took Tobruk, we'd probably lost the war.
Moorehead's defense of Tobruk would turn out to be one of the narrowest escapes of all. November 1939. Nazi Germany was celebrating victory over Poland. Standing just a few feet from the Führer was the man he trusted with his life, General Erwin Rommel, in charge of Hitler's bodyguard. Within months, Rommel was commanding his own panzer division in the blitzkrieg which humiliated France. Rommel was now Hitler's favorite general, and in February 1941, he was given a new mission. In Libya. When Rommel arrived at the port of Tripoli, his orders were to take a small armored unit of 20,000 men to give backbone to Hitler's Italian allies and stop them being driven out of North Africa by the British. Within weeks, Rommel unleashed his forces in a blitzkrieg attack. By early April, he had swept to within 100 miles of the Egyptian border. The way seemed open to the biggest prize of all, the Suez Canal. This man-made waterway was the vital artery that led to the oil fields of Iraq and Britain's empire in the east.
It's incredibly important because the Red Sea, the Suez Canal, the Mediterranean was the fast route for ships sailing from the east to the United Kingdom. The only other alternative was around the Cape of Good Hope, which was nasty and long and very difficult.
But as Rommel advanced towards Egypt, he ran into a problem. His own supply lines were becoming dangerously overstretched. Everything from fuel to food had to be driven some 1,500 miles overland. The solution seemed simple. Close to the Egyptian border was the port of Tobruk.
Tobruk is the only natural harbour on the North African coastline between Tunisia and Alexandria. So very significant geographically and strategically. And if he could use Tobruk harbour to sustain or to fuel his advance further into Egypt, then that would be ideal.
But Rommel wasn't alone in recognising Tobruk's importance. At British headquarters in Egypt, General Archibald Wavell now knew the only way to stop Rommel was to deny him access to Tobruk. But who could defend the port? Most of Wavell's crack troops were overseas defending Greece. Just 3 weeks earlier, the 9th Division of the Australian Imperial Force had arrived in Libya. These were the men Wavell chose to defend Tobruk. Despite their lack of experience, they brought with them a formidable reputation from the First World War.
This was the first time that these men had found themselves in battle. Many of them were young, and they were determined not to embarrass the record that their fathers had set in the First World War.
Luckily for them, they were led by Australia's finest soldier, Major General Leslie Moorehead, who had helped create that proud tradition. Back in 1915, he had left his job as a schoolmaster to fight at Gallipoli, the campaign which helped to forge Australia's national identity. Just a year later, he was in the grim battlefields of northern France, leading his men through one bitter struggle after another. In 1939, he had once again left civilian life to take another Australian force to war. Because of his reputation for tough discipline, his men jokingly named him after the comic villain Ming the Merciless.
Ming the Merciless wasn't a nasty epithet. It was one that was applied with some considerable pride by these Australian soldiers to their divisional commander. He wasn't a vicious or malicious man. He was very calm, very thoughtful, a remarkably intelligent man, very practical soldier, and incredibly well liked by all those who served under him.
In the first week of April 1941, near the town of Benghazi, Moorehead's men had already had their first experience of fighting Rommel. They'd been forced into a humiliating retreat back along the Libyan coast. But then the order came through from General Wavell. The port of Tobruk must be held for 8 weeks to buy Egypt time to defend itself. With Rommel hard on his heels, Moorehead rushed his troops into Tobruk. He would have barely a day to assess the town's defenses. He found the port itself full of wrecked ships, left behind when his fellow Australians had driven the Italians out just 3 months before. Despite the damage, the harbour was operational and could be a vital lifeline in the coming fight. But when it came to holding off Rommel, Moorehead could see difficulties. Both sides had roughly the same number of troops. But Rommel's combined Italian and German force had superior firepower. To counter this threat, Moorehead realized he would have to keep Rommel's tanks and artillery as far out of range as possible. Fortunately, some 9 miles out in the desert, Moorehead discovered elaborate fortifications built by the Italians. They stretched in a wide arc about 28 miles long. A line of anti-tank ditches linking 150 strongpoints blasted into the hard desert rock. This would be Moorehead's front line, manned by his Australian infantry. He immediately set them to work, laying minefields and deepening the anti-tank ditch. Behind this perimeter, Moorehead's plan was to set up multiple layers of defense. One of these was a mobile force, using his limited number of tanks.
You can conceive of a thin infantry screen around the defensive perimeter of Tobruk, and then at strategic points to the rear, groups of tanks who were able to be called in to counterattack any breakthrough.
In another defensive layer behind the front line, Moorehead placed his artillery. Many of the guns had been captured from the Italians. But what he needed was greater firepower. Back in Egypt, orders went out to a British regiment, the South Notts Hussars, who had recently taken delivery of 16 25-pounder guns. The only problem was, they were 700 miles away, near the Suez Canal. Sergeant Ray Ellis recalls when the movement order came through.
We knew it was going to be pretty hairy because it didn't escape our notice that the majority of the British Army was also driving as quickly as possible, but in the opposite direction.
While Ray Ellis's guns were on their way, Rommel and his advance party had already arrived outside Tobruk. Rommel was so used to beating the British, he expected the town to fall within a day. In the early hours of the 9th of April, he ordered one of his most senior officers to launch an immediate attack.
Rommel turned up in his tent, was outraged at the fact that this battalion commander was asleep, ordered him into his car. The man drove up against the defences. And was cut down by anti-tank fire and was killed.
This was Rommel's first indication that Tobruk would be no walkover. As more of his combined force of Germans and Italians arrived, he ordered them to encircle the town. But that evening, Ray Ellis and his guns just got through in time.
As we went into Tobruk, the wire was pulled apart, the regiment went over, and then the wire was closed behind us, and although we didn't know it then, but the siege of Tobruk had begun. We were the last people in, and we only just got there.
Their arrival meant Morshead now had all his lines of defence in place. But his men didn't underestimate their opponents.
We were all very well aware that only a year before, that German army had brought Europe to its knees. They appeared to be invincible. No one had been able to stop them.
April the 11th, 1941, was Good Friday. Tobruk's defenders prepared for battle. Ray Ellis was with his guns.
And the battery captain was a man named Slynn, Graham Slynn. A tall, slim man. We had the highest respect for him. We'd have followed him anywhere. And he talked to us and explained to us the situation and left us in no doubt that if we lost this battle, we'd probably lost the war. And he finished that with the words that Shakespeare wrote, Henry V saying before the Battle of Agincourt, "You know your places, go to them, and God be with you."
Left raging.
Ray's guns were soon in action.
400. Fire.
It was bloody hard, tiring work. We fired hundreds and hundreds of shells, and the guns glowed red.
Good Friday ended with the perimeter line still intact. Morshead's men had managed to surprise Rommel, on that first day at least.
He had no idea that the Australians and the British defenders would be as tenacious as they were, but he hadn't done his preparation well enough.
In his haste, Rommel hadn't even obtained a plan of the fortifications from his Italian allies. As a result, Morshead had outsmarted him.
The anti-tank ditch was not a massive obstacle, but it was mined and it was covered by machine guns, and the obvious points of entry were also well prepared in terms of the artillery and tanks. Rommel had no idea that any of this existed.
For most of the following day, a sandstorm prevented another attack. But Rommel was still convinced Tobruk would soon fall. It was time for some psychological warfare. On the morning of Easter Sunday, Morshead's men were preparing for the next onslaught. But this plane wasn't dropping bombs. The general officer commanding the German forces in Libya requests that the troops occupying Tobruk surrender. Single soldiers waving white handkerchiefs are not fired on. For General Morshead, there was only one possible response.
Because of the prevailing dust and need to ration water, no white handkerchiefs are available.
His men would fight on. And Morshead was already anticipating Rommel's next move.
The thing that demonstrates Morshead's ability more than anything else was his innate flexibility. He thought things through. He analysed what Rommel was throwing at him and came up with the best way of solving that particular problem, and that's a measure of Morshead's greatness.
His main concern was a combined attack by Rommel's tanks and infantry. Knowing this was bound to happen, he had come up with a plan. If the tanks broke through, rather than retreat, he told his men on the front line to hold their positions, let the tanks go past, and deal with the infantry following behind.
The Australians were a very, very strong bunch, and when Morshead told them in Tobruk to stand and fight, there was no arguing with that.
That Easter morning, Sunday the 13th of April, Ray Ellis was acting as an observer for the artillery.
Whilst I was in the observation post, which was the front line with the Australian infantry, I had the hair-raising experience of watching German tanks ploughing across the desert, approaching our position. And the first thing I learned was the German machine gun didn't go tut-tut-tut-tut-tut-tut. It went ah! It was so fast. It made you realise their equipment was so good. To see those tracks looming toward you is screamingly frightening. And they passed right over us. They overran our position and were behind us in our own line.
But as the tanks went past, Morshead's Australians obeyed orders, stood their ground, and then took the fight to the German infantry.
I was standing in the middle of a bayonet fight, which I couldn't take any part in because being an artilleryman, I knew nothing about bayonet fighting. I was terrified. And men were screaming in agony and bayonets were being stuck into stomachs and it was horrifying. Thank God the Australians won that particular sortie. The German infantry withdrew, many of them to hide in the anti-tank ditch.
Just 100 yards away from Ray Ellis, another Australian patrol set off in pursuit of the German infantry. Charging into heavy machine gun fire. 26-year-old Corporal John Edmondson was mortally wounded. But when he saw his lieutenant in danger, he fought on and saved his comrade's life. Edmondson died soon after. But he became the first Australian to win the Victoria Cross in the Second World War. Despite all this, Rommel's panzers had broken through and were heading for the heart of Tobruk. In desperation, Ray Ellis's guns were now turned around to fire towards their own lines.
We were bringing shell fire down behind us in our own lines because the German tanks were through. It was a near thing.
Only the failing light saved the port of Tobruk. Unable to see their way forward, the panzers were forced to hole up for the few hours of darkness. Just enough time for Morshead to call in his tanks waiting in reserve. At dawn, on Easter Monday, the battle began again. Eventually, the panzers were driven back beyond the perimeter. But for Ray Ellis and his gun team, there was no respite.
Those gunners had been fighting 4 days. They'd had no rest. And that Easter Monday, eyes were like slits. Our faces were caked with sand and sweat. Behind each gun was a great pile of spent cartridge cases. And then sometime on Monday evening, the Germans withdrew and stopped the fire. The front went quiet, and we knew, at least for the time being, we'd stopped him. And we just dropped where we were on the desert floor and went to sleep and left the guns to cool themselves in the night air. It was the end of the first battle.
For the first time in the Second World War, the much-feared panzers had been stopped in their tracks. And Rommel's elite machine gun battalion had been nearly wiped out, losing 1,100 men.
He'd come up against a steel ring around Tobruk, and nothing he could do could break it. His ability to slice through defenses like butter just didn't work.
It was round one to Morshead, and he was already planning his next move. He believed the best form of defense now would be to attack. Every night, he sent his Australian infantry out on patrol to make no man's land their land. Their orders were to plot enemy positions, creep up on sentries and slit their throats, or capture prisoners for interrogation. It soon had the desired effect.
The Germans were scared when they had to come up against the Australians. And it's fair to say that the Germans wouldn't leave the trenches because of the threat of encountering a bunch of tough Australians with knuckle dusters and knives.
But there was one area that was not under General Moorehead's control. The sky above Tobruk. All Moorehead had was a handful of RAF Hurricanes operating from airstrips within the perimeter.
They didn't last very long. And I remember one of them, we watched him in the sky, a lone Hurricane, and we saw 5 Messerschmitts dive on this one plane. And he crashed right on our gun position. Brave man.
Moorehead's troops were now exposed to constant attack from the air.
You could actually see the German dive bombers taking off to come and dive bomb you. They were so close.
Rommel used his Stukas as aerial artillery, trying to blast Tobruk into submission.
They come over in formation, and then they break into a line, and then over the top of you, they come screaming down onto the position. And you're looking in the sky. And then you see the bombs leave the plane as it screams over the top of you, machine gunning as well. And the bombs fall all around you and the whole ground shakes. And if you're lucky, you get up to see them disappear.
The harbour was hit by 52 raids in just the first 3 weeks. Under this constant bombardment, the only refuge was to go underground. Moorehead and his staff operated from a cave complex left behind by the Italians.
The whole gamut of a division in the defence was managed from a hole in the ground.
The hollowed-out rooms were lined with concrete, ideal protection from the Luftwaffe.
His cave was his nerve centre, and it was where the telephones and the radios would work from.
Moorehead was able to keep in touch with his troops, thanks to the hastily repaired Italian telephone system. With such a wide area to defend, communication was vital.
He was in daily contact with his unit commanders, a British brigadier in charge of the armour and Australian officers as well.
Conditions underground were grim, so his men had to improvise as best they could. Old ship's funnels gave excellent ventilation. But for everyone in Tobruk, fleas and flies were a constant problem. And for Ray Ellis, out on the desert plateau, life was even harsher.
People don't realise that Tobruk wasn't lovely soft sand. You couldn't dig deep entrenchments, it was rock. And so our little shelters were shallow. Imagine sitting in a desert 24 hours a day with no cover, no shelter from the sun, day after day after day after day. We were never, ever out of action.
Rommel was soon trying another type of psychological warfare.
Germany calling, Germany calling. Here is the news. In North Africa, Stukas scored direct bomb hits on the town and harbour of Tobruk on Saturday night.
The voice of German propaganda, known to the troops as Lord Haw-Haw, dismissed Moorehead's men as rats, hiding in their holes in the ground. But the jibe misfired.
And that was the official German communique of the day.
He referred to us as the rats of Tobruk, you know, who'll soon be turfed out, type of thing. And I don't know how it happened, but we cottoned on to it somehow.
Lord Haw-Haw's insult became a badge of honour.
Right then, we're the rats of Tobruk, or movers then, type of thing. And so we became proud of being the rats of Tobruk, and I still am. It didn't move us.
Rommel and his Italian allies launched another major attack at the end of April, 18 days into the siege. The Panzers broke through again, but this time they ran into one of Moorehead's minefields. Once more, his multiple layers of defence had saved Tobruk. The Nazi war machine had been brought to a halt by a mixed bag of British and Australian troops. Back in England, still recovering from the humiliation of Dunkirk, and with the nightmare of the Blitz still on everyone's mind, Tobruk's survival was a rare piece of good news for Winston Churchill. He knew what was at stake and was determined to help.
The whole Empire is watching your steadfast and spirited defense of this important outpost of Egypt with gratitude and determination.
To save the Suez Canal, the gateway to Britain's empire in the east, Churchill now took the risk of sending his last reserve of tanks out to Egypt. He nicknamed them his Tiger Cubs and urged General Wavell to use them to relieve the siege of Tobruk as soon as possible.
Churchill was very impetuous. Churchill didn't think, because he'd never been to Staff College, that actually these tanks needed to be prepared for war. They'd come straight out of the factories. They were just not in a fit state to be sent into battle against Rommel's panzers.
It would be another month before the tanks were ready. Meanwhile, Moorehead and his men would have to stand alone in Tobruk, where the summer heat was making conditions even tougher.
There was very, very little water to go around. Troops would be rationed to something like a mess tin of water a day, which they had to drink and use for their ablutions and shaving.
Our water came from wells near the coast, and it was brackish. If you're living with brackish water, you'd never lose your thirst. We were always thirsty.
Food was limited to a diet of corned beef, known as bully beef, and bread or biscuits.
Bully beef was our main food, and most old soldiers hate the sound of it. Strange as it must seem, I love it still, and I loved it then. Why? Because I was bloody hungry. Sometimes it came in the tin and you opened it and you could more or less pour it out almost because it's so hot. But usually it came as bully stew. During the whole of the siege, you must remember, we never saw any fruit or vegetables, anything like that, in green. Everything was tinned. And everyone had to take 2 ascorbic acid tablets every day to stop us getting scurvy.
All their food had to come in by sea from Egypt, on what Tobruk's defenders called the Spud Run. For them, it was a vital lifeline. But for the Navy, it became known as the Suicide Run. There were constant attacks from the air. And from beneath the waves. Some 30 ships would be sunk before the end of the siege. The Germans were trying to starve Tobruk into submission. General Morshead did his best to keep up morale. His men began publishing their own newspaper, the Tobruk Truth. It was a vital link to the outside world, a daily digest of broadcasts from the BBC. In June, Morshead's men had now held on for the 8 weeks Wavell had requested, and at last, Winston Churchill's 200 precious tiger cubs were ready for action. The plan was to use them to drive Rommel's troops back from the Egyptian border. But Rommel was waiting for them. His guns destroyed over 90 of the tiger cubs. The rest retreated, leaving Tobruk still cut off. As weeks now turned into months, the defenders had to adapt to life under siege.
To survive in those conditions, you have to close your mind to realities. You have to, otherwise you go mad. You've got to close your mind to the fear of death. You've got to close your mind to the fear of being maimed and blinded. You've got to close your mind to the fact that you're losing dearly loved friends. And laugh. Kick it over and laugh, otherwise you go mad. And that's what we did.
The arrival of mail from England brought a rare moment of relief for Ray Ellis.
I had the marvellous pleasure of receiving a parcel from home. It had been all the way down the Atlantic, all the way around the Cape of Good Hope, up the Indian Ocean, through it, and it got to Tobruk.
Among the gifts was a packet of balloons.
And I'm sitting in the front line with the Australian infantry, with a packet of balloons. And all the time, this firing going on, machine guns and the odd mortar, the typical front line, we were used to it.
Ray decided to have some fun.
I blew up a balloon, tied a knot in it, poked it up into the air. And the whole front went quiet. The Germans stopped firing. Everything stopped. He must have been saying, "What's this? Secret weapon?" Then they realised what it was, and they were firing at it with rifles. And boom! And they'd shoot one, you see it. And then we'd blow a red one up. And the whole front became a game. This went on for about 15 minutes. When the last balloon went, we fired a very light into the sky. And there was a moment or two, and they fired one back. Then there was a pause, and the battle went on again, machine gun and that.
Events in the outside world were also now shaping the battle for Tobruk. Hitler had launched his invasion of Russia in June 1941. The massive call on resources meant that General Rommel couldn't get the reinforcements he needed to deliver a killer blow against Tobruk. Meanwhile, in August, Winston Churchill crossed the Atlantic to meet President Roosevelt. Eager to persuade America to join the war, Churchill used Tobruk as a symbol of defiance to show that Nazi Germany could be defeated.
If we'd given up Tobruk, we would have been seen by the Americans as willing only to surrender and willing only to run at the first sign of a fight. And our resistance as a Commonwealth in 1941 was incredibly important in the battles that Churchill had to fight with the Americans to persuade a reluctant American public to support yet another war in Europe.
But by August, General Morshead and his Australians had been besieged for 5 months. And Churchill now faced another political challenge.
The Australian Prime Minister was determined to ensure that the Australians didn't become the sacrificial lambs in Tobruk, and they wouldn't bear the siege alone.
The Australian Prime Minister demanded his troops be evacuated, and Winston Churchill finally had to agree. So began one of the most challenging operations of the siege. The ships that had been Tobruk's lifeline on the Spud Run were now asked to bring in British and Polish reinforcements and take out the Australians. This remarkable exchange of thousands of troops was carried out in secret under cover of darkness between August and October 1941. Its success was a final achievement for General Morshead.
No one was lost. The Germans at no time recognized what was going on. It was done with consummate skill, both at the level of the individual soldiers and, of course, at the level of Morshead and the planners.
On October the 22nd, General Morshead himself finally departed.
It's fair to say that Morshead bitterly disagreed with his political masters in Canberra, but being the good soldier he was, he did as he was told.
Morshead could leave with pride in a job well done. Asked to hold on for 8 weeks, he had kept the enemy at bay for 7 months. Now he was handing over to his British replacement, General Ronald Scobie, to finish the job. But there was no escape for Ray Ellis and his gunners. They would be there for another 2 months. In late November, Operation Crusader began. The plan was for the Tobruk garrison to break out, forcing their way through Rommel's lines to join up with the British 8th Army advancing from Egypt. Operation Crusader was to prove one of the bitterest battles of the whole siege. But finally, in early December, the 8th Army reached Tobruk's defenders. Erwin Rommel, Hitler's favorite general, was forced to admit he was now outnumbered and outgunned. He beat a humiliating retreat. After 242 days of siege, Ray Ellis couldn't quite believe it was all over.
Never forget that. He's retreating. And then we heard that Rommel had withdrawn down the desert and Tobruk was relieved. And we never ever thought we'd get out of it, but we did.
The heroic stand by the rats of Tobruk, led by General Morshead, had destroyed the myth of German invincibility.
Morshead stopped Rommel in his tracks. No one had ever done that before. Very few people were going to do that again. Here was an Australian schoolmaster who was able to stand up to him, and stand up to him he did. His success needs far, far greater recognition than he's been given hitherto. He's an understated hero.
Morshead's defense of Tobruk wasn't just a narrow escape for him and his men. It also saved the vital route through Egypt's Suez Canal. The British Empire could fight on alone until America joined the war.
The real legacy of the 242-day siege of Tobruk was the fact that Britain had time to prepare for the defense of Egypt and build up the support from the United States and prepare itself to counter the German menace in North Africa. 1941 was the year in which Britain won the war.
Most heavily armed convoy in history, going head-to-head with Hitler and Mussolini in a maritime battle that would determine the course of the Second World War.
It was like a version of hell. Things were really coming at them from all angles.
The amount of damage they inflicted was terrifying.
At its heart, a state-of-the-art American oil tanker, the SS Ohio, the fastest in the world, on a last-ditch mission to deliver essential fuel supplies to the besieged island of Malta.
When the flames go higher than the top of the mast, it's a bit worrying.
She and her escort of over 50 warships would run around-the-clock gauntlet of attacks from air and sea in a bid to save the island's stronghold. Our mission was crucial to the Allied war effort, and if it failed, the Germans would control the Mediterranean, take North Africa, and cut Britain off from her empire. Germans and Italians in 1942, control of the Mediterranean was vital for the prize of North Africa. For over a year, the German general, Rommel, had been fighting the British in Libya and Egypt. Vital to keep his army fighting were supply ships, bringing arms across the Mediterranean from Europe. And in their path lay Malta, a tiny island just 20 kilometers long. It could have been just one of the many islands in the Med, except for one thing. It was a lone British base. Its sole job, to send submarines and aircraft out to attack Rommel's supply ships. It was brilliant in its role, and a nightmare for the Axis ambitions in North Africa. And so, Hitler and Mussolini besieged it, making the most of its overwhelming isolation. Its nearest friends, Gibraltar, 1,000 miles to the west, and Alexandria, the same distance to the east, and all around it was enemy territory. And the siege had taken its toll. For years, Malta's suffering had been enormous, even by wartime standards. Month after month of bombing, starvation, and deprivation had reduced the island to a wreck. Typhoid was common, with tens of thousands of homes destroyed. Many people were forced to live in caves. But its supplies could only come by sea, on heavily armed convoys, on the very waters that were now teeming with enemy forces at the height of their powers. Axis bases in Sicily and Corsica launched German dive bombers and torpedo-carrying aircraft. Italian submarines and torpedo boats patrolled constantly. Mussolini's powerful, modern, state-of-the-art navy was backed up by skilled units of the Luftwaffe. By contrast, Britain's sea power was massively overstretched, and the floor of the Mediterranean Sea was littered with the wrecks of its convoys that the Axis powers had destroyed. But Churchill knew that losing Malta was not an option. Those losses were the price he'd have to pay to keep the island free and fighting, and keep Hitler and Mussolini from ruling over the Med.
For 2 years, the Royal Navy had been supplying the island and keeping it going against the threat from both the Italians and the Germans. But they were both getting stronger, and the Royal Navy were getting weaker because Japan had come into the war. Lots of convoys had been run to Malta, but it was getting harder and harder to get them through.
In March 1942, Malta suffered its heaviest bout of Axis bombing yet. Over 6,000 tons of high explosive rained down on the island in a single month. By May, urgent messages from the island's governor reached London. There was only 6 weeks' worth of supplies left. After that, the island's population would tip into famine and, with its aircraft out of fuel and grounded, Malta would have to surrender. In great secrecy, another relief operation was prepared. It would be the 21st Convoy, and the last of its kind. Codenamed Operation Pedestal, this would be the biggest, the most heavily armed, and the most ambitious convoy yet, and it would have to succeed.
Churchill's determined to put all the resources he could spare. It was all or nothing. If this convoy didn't get through, then the island just couldn't hold out much longer.
To shut down Rommel, Malta needed fuel for its aircraft and its submarines, and lots of it. Desperate as the Maltese were for food and basic essentials, it was kerosene and diesel that made all the difference. The search was on for an elite supertanker that would keep the island's Spitfires in the air and the enemy on the back foot. It would need sufficient capacity to turn the tide of the war with a single massive consignment of fuel, and it would need to be very fast. That ship would be the SS Ohio. And it was found not in Britain's merchant fleet, but in America, home to the world's largest oil tankers. Already a holder of a speed record, she was the biggest oil tanker of her day, 9,000 tons and 500 feet long. She would be capable of carrying some 20,000 tons of fuel, enough to keep Malta fighting fit for months. From her quiet backwaters on the US East Coast, she steamed to Glasgow to be fitted out for a role that would make history. From a peacetime cargo ship, she was about to become the secret weapon in the fight for the Mediterranean. Now she would be armed and fitted for some of the fiercest fighting of any maritime conflict. Anti-aircraft guns were mounted on her decks, her sides armor-plated to take torpedo hits. The ship was prepared for Malta's last stand, as no oil tanker had been prepared before.
They put military gunners, army gunners and navy gunners on board as extra crew. So she had a lot of extra people and she had a lot of extra guns. They did everything they could to ensure that she could withstand a bit of punishment, which, as things turned out, was just as well.
Her master was an English merchant mariner who was a stranger to naval warfare. The 39-year-old Captain Dudley Mason was more used to steering oil tankers through peacetime shipping lanes, but would now have to take one through the deadliest 1,000 miles of sea in the world. It would be an assignment that would make him famous.
The captain chosen to take over command of the Ohio was a very experienced man, and as it turned out, a very tough and resilient man, an ideal choice.
Alongside the Ohio would be some of the finest merchant vessels in British waters. They would form a roll of honor with names that would go down in history. The Port Chalmers, the Empire Hope, the Glenorchy, and the Brisbane Star. Each was armed with heavy anti-aircraft guns and reinforced, then loaded with supplies, fuel and ammunition, food and medicines, and a few luxuries, chocolate and cigarettes, even post. When the great merchant armada of 14 vessels was ready, it sailed to Gibraltar to meet the biggest naval escort that had ever been assembled. 59 warships from all over the world had come for the fight. Among them, 2 battleships, 4 aircraft carriers, 7 light cruisers, and 34 destroyers. By the first week of August, some 23,000 men were dedicated to Pedestal. As well as the Royal Navy and the RAF, the seamen of the British Merchant Navy, who'd never signed up for fighting but would be put in the severest danger, were at the vanguard. Among the British crew of the Ohio, Alan Shaw was an 18-year-old deckhand who'd no idea of the purpose of the mission till it was well underway. And when he saw the massive naval fleet assembled to defend his ship, danger was the last thing on his mind.
When we saw the size of the escort, you didn't have any problems at all, you know. There was 3 or 4 times more Navy ships than there was us, 2 big battleships and 4 aircraft carriers, and nothing could touch you.
The pride of the fleet was HMS Eagle, an aircraft carrier that was a veteran of the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean. With a substantial reputation for crushing Italian shipping in her many convoy operations, she was a formidable force to have on your side. Beside the Eagle and 2 other aircraft carriers was another carrier, the HMS Furious. Her sole mission was to dispatch 38 Spitfires to Malta as air cover for the convoy when it arrived within range. The challenges facing the convoy were very well known to both sides. These were old adversaries, and the route was nothing short of a shooting gallery. Hostile or unsympathetic forces lay on all sides, and the Armada's only hope would be speed, resilience, and sheer cunning, as the Axis powers took them on from all sides, above and below. And even if the combined forces of the German and Italian bombers, submarines, and torpedo boats failed, Mussolini could still summon the big guns of the Regia Marina, his ultra-modern, massively powerful battle fleet, to give the convoy a coup de grace. The convoy's commanders knew they'd need every weapon at their disposal to stand a chance of getting the SS Ohio through to Malta. On Tuesday, the 11th of August, Operation Pedestal went live, and the convoy sailed, not into battle, but into a beautiful Mediterranean summer. For a while, a holiday mood settled. Seemingly far away from wartime Europe. Ted Fawcett was a young naval officer and gunnery specialist on a brand new destroyer, HMS Branham. Like many of his colleagues, He even dared to hope that the threat from the enemy had been overestimated.
We started off in beautiful sunny weather, calm seas, and we had been going for 2 days and thought, this is simply marvellous. Nothing happening at all. We're going to have the most lovely cruise there and cruise back.
You went on lookout, you went and did your turn at the wheel, you did your turn at the standby and fetching and carrying for people. So it was just a normal trip, you know, the first day out. Glorious weather.
But the war was anything but far away. As Pedestal's men admired the weather, fathoms below, a deadly enemy was preparing. Undetected as it glided through the chilly depths, a lone submarine carefully stalked the convoy. Gradually closing in, it maneuvered with meticulous precision. And just after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, it struck.
4 thumps. And we saw plumes of spray come up around the Eagle.
Pedestal was barely underway, and the Eagle, the pride of the fleet and the convoy's strongest protector, had been hit.
It was listing over and you could see in the distance all the airplanes and that sliding off into the water.
She sank incredibly quickly.
Four torpedoes had torn into the great carrier that had done so much damage to the Axis. 260 men were dead and 12 aircraft lost.
You're well aware that there are many men in that ship who are in fact trapped with no way of getting out and no way of surviving. On land, you can see the broken tanks and the wrecked aircraft, bodies even lying around. War at sea is very much different. When a ship sinks, the sea washes over it, and that is it.
It was frightening. It was a foretaste of what was likely to happen. And we were all shaken out of any feeling of this is going to be a holiday cruise.
That's when the trouble started.
Now the pride of the fleet was destroyed, and the battle was on. The Eagle may have been lost, but the Ohio and her 13 sister ships forged on into the night in tight formation, so far untouched. Fanned around them in front, beside, and behind, 58 of Britain's finest naval vessels, bristling with armaments, sweeping the sea for mines and laying depth charges to take out submarines. As dawn broke on the 12th of August, the men of the convoy scanned the waters ceaselessly for threats and any chance they might seize to avenge the Eagle. They wouldn't have to wait long, but their next contact would not come from below, but from the skies above. Now the artillerymen of the 72 ships braced themselves. On HMS Bramham was a young gunner, Reginald Coker. Just 22 years old, he had seen HMS Hood sunk by the Germans the year before and was keen to show the Luftwaffe what a British convoy could do.
The barrage that was put up over the fleet, the RAF people used to refer to it as the flak was such you could almost walk on it with the bursting shells and that sort of thing. There was no damage done to any of the ships, and the attack was quite easily beaten off. That was the first attack, of course.
By mid-morning, Pedestal had shown its muscle. 120 German and Italian planes had been sent packing with ease. Pride surged through the formations, as well as cautious confidence. But within hours, a new threat emerged. An Italian submarine had penetrated the convoy's defenses unnoticed. Quietly squaring up to two of the most precious cruisers in the naval escort. HMS Cairo and HMS Nigeria had been especially fitted out with long-range radar and high-powered communications to help spot and shut down Axis air attacks early. Now, a single volley of torpedoes caused the most damage by any submarine in the entire operation. The first and second homed in on the cruisers and hit them. Both were instantly disabled. But there was more. The third and fourth torpedoes continued into the convoy's ranks, seeking the ultimate prize. And this time, the SS Ohio would not be spared.
The torpedo got us and we just felt a big bump and we thought we'd had a collision or something, but then the fire started.
A hole 10 meters square had been punched into the side of the Ohio. Flames ripped past tanks loaded with kerosene on the lower decks and burst into the open air. The ship was struggling with her first full assault, barely 24 hours into the mission. It should have been a death blow. But the Ohio's master, Dudley Mason, now showed how cool he could be under fire. Resisting the temptation to abandon ship, he waited for inrushing seawater to quell the flames and then ordered a firefighting party to finish the job. But the assault nailed one illusion squarely on the head, that the Ohio was so well protected that it had nothing to fear.
When the flames go higher than the top of the mast, it's a bit worrying. The engines had stopped, everything had stopped. And then after it all quietened down and we got the fire out, we got the engine started again. But we'd had no compass. The gyro compass was thrown off balance.
The fires may have been tamed, but the Ohio's steering was wrecked, and the great ship skewed off course into the path of her neighbors, narrowly avoiding a collision. Now the convoy was thrown into disarray, and it struggled to maintain discipline and direction, so crucial for keeping momentum and a tight defense. As if sensing the opportunity, the Axis forces now seized their chance. Italian and German bombers swept in. The infamous Junker 87s, the Stuka dive bombers, made the most of the disorganized fleet and took out 3 merchant ships with ease. The Empire Hope and the Clan Ferguson were sunk outright. while the Brisbane Star was disabled. As the men of Operation Pedestal fought to keep control and order, they now entered their third night, facing the most dangerous part of the route. The heavily defended straits between Sicily and Tunisia, a bottleneck called the Sicilian Narrows, would test Mason and his men to the limit.
It was during the night that the really terrifying intensity of attack took place. The Axis had concentrated their submarines, their E-boats, and bombers to really deal with our fleet. And the amount of damage they inflicted was terrifying.
As the Axis pincer tightened its grip, the Italians launched their most effective weapon yet: torpedo-firing E-boats. Quick, small, and stealthy, they attacked Pedestal in hit-and-run operations throughout the night, aiming at ships already ablaze to send them down.
We could see an immense explosion fill the entire sky as a ship laden with ammunition, petrol, oil, just went up in one colossal bang. And one could not see how anybody could possibly survive under those sort of circumstances.
Through the night, torpedoes slammed into 4 more merchant vessels. Some sank instantly, others burned out to uselessness. Pedestal was being ground down to a remnant. And by dawn, the torpedoes had done their worst. The Convoy had been reduced to a fraction of its original size.
It was a really dreadful moment. That great fleet of convoy and escorts was so drastically reduced the next morning out of all the enormous fleet that we had before. There were 4 merchant ships, a handful of destroyers, and we just had this tiny remnant of the convoy steering rather erratically by that time towards Malta, which was still miles away.
But despite the massive damage all around her, the Ohio was still afloat. And for the Axis powers, all efforts focused on destroying her as soon as possible. Now, the German Air Force intensified its attacks. Deadly Stukas and other bombers sped down at the tanker, zeroing, then releasing their lethal payloads before sweeping up.
You could see them queuing up miles away, and then they just came down in droves. Beat the hell out of you. It was deafening. When the destroyers and all the merchant ships all opening up with guns at the same time, and you couldn't hear anything. It was just, you were sort of deaf, you know.
60 dives in all rained down at the Ohio. Near misses buckled the tanker's plates. Another filled her prow with water. A crippled aircraft skittered across the waves and slammed into the ship's sides, its wings breaking up across the Ohio's decks. And then, the unthinkable. a German bomber crash-landed onto the decks of the tanker herself.
One aircraft landed on the foredeck. It skimmed off the water, and we had another Stuka landed on the main deck. And we sort of threw everything over the side and just continued on.
Finally, two massive bombs detonated in the sea, literally blowing the whole enormous tanker out of the water.
It was a bit hairy because they were lifting the ship out of the water, and she was sort of shuddering when you come down, and you were stood on the deck and your feet were leaving the deck. The bombs were that close.
The bombs may not have sunk the tanker, but they had inflicted critical damage. For the force of the blast blew out the fires of the ship's boilers and shut her down. The Ohio was afloat, but powerless to move. With no way of going forward, she was a sitting target, adrift, her mission seemingly doomed. And sure enough, at that moment, Mussolini sent in his state-of-the-art navy, the deadly Regia Marina. On his direct orders, a force of battleships, cruisers and destroyers sailed directly towards the convoy to finish it off and seize the prize of sending Pedestal to the bottom of the ocean. But as the last of the light faded to night, a tiny ray of hope persisted. Malta, the desperate island the convoy had come to save, might just offer some assistance to her beleaguered rescuers with a tiny, ragtag force of long-range Wellington bombers. In an abrupt change of roles, Pedestal's commanders sent an emergency plea to Malta's Air Vice Marshal. It was a desperate initiative, and even if Malta's Air Force could be mustered in time, it would have to reckon with the Luftwaffe air cover of Mussolini's battleships. Nevertheless, there would be one last bid to avert disaster. With extraordinary daring, Malta's RAF now set about a classic deception. The Wellington bombers were ordered to fly over the advancing Italian fleet and start bombing. At the same time, they dropped illuminating flares and called in non-existent US Air Force liberators in radio messages intended for interception. To Italian ears, it now seemed that a massive Allied air force was on its way to obliterate Mussolini's prized Regia Marina, for once unprotected by the Luftwaffe. Within hours, and to the astonishment of Pedestal's commanders and the RAF on Malta, the Italian fleet abruptly changed course, steaming directly away from the convoy and back to port. It had been stood down by Il Duce himself. Pedestal was still in with a chance.
They bluffed Mussolini into thinking that his fleet that he was going to send out to destroy us, the RAF bluffed him that they had a force of very heavy bombers that were going over and really annihilate his fleet.
But there would be little time for celebration. If the Italians had no appetite for the fight, the Germans were determined to see the Ohio on the floor of the Med, and, within hours, the Luftwaffe swept in to finish off the convoy. Once again, intense bombing besieged the ships. When a massive 1,000-pounder smashed down into the water next to the Ohio, it cracked her keel in two. It would have sunk any other ship instantly, but even though the tanker survived, her integrity was broken. She had already lost her engines, but now she was severely weakened and close to disintegration. It was only a matter of time before she broke up and sank. With great reluctance, the Ohio's master, Captain Mason, ordered his men off the ship. It was time to abandon the Ohio for everyone's safety. But while she was afloat, there was hope that she could somehow be salvaged. And with 90 miles still to go to Malta, keeping the tanker moving was all that mattered. The only solution was that the Ohio would have to be towed. But this seemingly straightforward operation turned out to be impossible, for one very simple reason.
She couldn't make any headway because when the big bomb hit us, it jammed the rudder. So we were just swinging around to port all the time. And when she tried to tow us, the Ohio was taking the destroyer round. She was just going round in circles.
With all their attention on getting the stalled Ohio back on course, the Pedestal convoy was now extremely vulnerable. And with perfect timing, German bombers came in for the kill. Where the Italian Navy had failed, the Germans would surely take the prize with ease. But this time, they would be in for a shock. For Pedestal had, by now, just scraped to within range of Malta's Spitfires. The squadron of 38, delivered just days earlier by HMS Furious, now had their chance to remind the Luftwaffe that it still didn't rule the Med. With the convoy's tormentors in their sights, sortie after sortie now came screaming over the horizon. As dawn broke, the convoy found a battle raging above that kept its German attackers at bay. Bolstered by the Spitfires, the crew reboarded the Ohio and took to her guns, blasting the air with as much flak as they could. Joined by volunteers from other ships, the great tanker was back in business and giving as good as she got. But beneath the bravery, the terrifying reality was impossible to ignore. For in the bowels of the great ship, Captain Mason was assessing her chances. It was a sobering sight. Her back broken and hull sections at bursting point, the Ohio was on the verge of disintegration. Mason told his officers that in 12 hours she would come apart, regardless of enemy action. The possibility loomed that she would break up and sink within sight of Malta. with less than a day before she would sink. Seamen with hundreds of years of experience between them racked their brains for a solution to get the Ohio into Malta's harbor in time. Finally, they decided to gamble on an idea that would have been ridiculed just hours before.
Eventually, the more senior officers said, well, we'll give Baines's suggestion a try. And it was Baines, our captain's suggestion, that we lash ourselves alongside the Ohio and use the whole thing as a kind of trimaran. As soon as we got alongside the Ohio, of course, there was the matter of rigging all the wires and hawsers and that sort of thing. And that was quite a, an operation, in fact, to do just that.
It was a wildly ungainly proposal to build an improvised trimaran on the open sea by lashing together a sinking oil tanker and 2 destroyers. But there was nothing for it but to risk it. And so the destroyers, HMS Bremen and HMS Penn, shouldered the stricken Ohio, each lashed to opposing sides. Buoying her up, they nudged her forward with their relatively light engines. With agonizing slowness, the trio limped in the direction of Malta as the tanker's final minutes ticked by. Now, it was a race against time. As the convoy pressed on into the dusk, misty shapes took form on the horizon. The cliffs of Malta. Exhaustion was now seizing the men of the convoy. Some had not slept for nearly a week. Many had eaten only a few biscuits, surviving merely on adrenaline.
Everyone was dead tired, and people tended to speak almost in whispers. The sea was absolute dead flat, and all you heard was the lap of the sea against the hull of the ship. And you heard the straining of the wires now and then again the occasional muffled orders coming from the bridge. It was that kind of eerie silence on a beautiful starlit night.
I was on watch during the last night, and I suddenly saw an old friend on the side of the bridge, and I held out my hand to him and said, "Good Lord, I haven't seen you for ages." It turned out to be a searchlight. By that time, we were hallucinating, and that, I think, was fairly common.
Within a few hours, the mouth of the harbor was dimly visible. But now, the Ohio faced the trickiest stretch of water yet. And the threat didn't come from the Germans or the Italians, but from her own side. For the lashed trio of vessels would have to maneuver their way through the dense minefield, defending Malta's harbor. The Ohio, with only the propulsion of the destroyers at her side to steer with, now had to inch her way along a slender channel fringed by deadly mines that would blow with the gentlest knock. Any deviation in the darkness would send the battered remains of Pedestal sky high.
The ship, they still had trouble trying to keep her straight, and she turned broadside on into the minefields. Well, you've only got a certain amount of room, and then you're among the mines, but just before we got to the harbour, they managed to get her turned around. Of course, we were pleased to get in then.
One by one, the surviving ships of the convoy limped in. The Port Chalmers, the Brisbane Star, and HMS Rye, carrying crews that had been assaulted by continual conflict for 6 days and nights. And finally, the SS Ohio. HMS Penn and HMS Bramham at her sides.
The whole of what had been Malta was blackened by people sitting on the remains of their houses to cheer us in. They realized, just as the Germans had realized, that the Ohio was the key to the whole thing.
Very humbling to get there. I mean, they'd been bombed for years and we'd only been in trouble for 3 or 4 days. And there was thousands waving and cheering and music playing, and it was a great welcome.
And you can imagine what it felt like to be a young man coming into that kind of welcome. There's no doubt that it was one of the great moments of one's life. The relief was unbelievable.
The SS Ohio had arrived in Malta intact. Her precious cargo of fuel for the Spitfires and submarines had safely been brought into harbour. But even now, the crew could not relax. Without a second's delay, thousands of tons of precious fuel needed to be removed from the fragile ship before she sank.
We tied her up, and of course we left the ship then, and the dockers took over and started taking the oil out of her, and they lost very little. They got all the rest of the cargo out before she settled on the bottom. All the decks were all buckled up. Her back was broken then, like.
After the narrowest of escapes, Pedestal had achieved its mission, and now Malta could continue with its work. Replenished with diesel and kerosene, its submarines and aircraft continued to starve the German General Rommel of supplies, until his ambitions in North Africa ground to a halt. Malta itself was never taken.
This was the turning point of the Mediterranean operation. Had we failed, Malta would have had to give in within a fortnight. Then there would have been no base from which to attack Italian and German shipping going to North Africa. Rommel would have had as much reinforcement as he could possibly want, and the war would have been prolonged probably by another 2 years. So it is possible to say that Operation Pedestal was one of the crucial turning points of the war.
The Ohio's master, Dudley Mason, returned to London, where he was awarded the George Cross. As for the Ohio, the ship that refused to go down continued to refuse. Within hours of offloading her cargo, she sank, but only by a few feet, for she came to rest on the shallow bed at her harbour mooring. And there she remained, giving excellent service as a storehouse and barracks until well after the war, and Malta's freedom was assured.
Well, we didn't want to leave her. We thought we were coming back home on her, you know. But it was disappointing for us because she was a good ship, she was a great ship.
Only when the guns of war had long fallen silent was she sunk in deep water off Malta, the final resting place for the ship that had kept the island free.